dude, I feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
Fellas, and ladies, welcome back to another episode of The Farm. We're sitting down today with my man, Matt Krug, and we're going to actually get into it. We actually had a joke offline. We're talking about how many times people mispronounce your name and then you just let it slide. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that's part of the strategy there, but yeah, no. So I had to make sure we actually got it right off the jump because everybody calls you Krug all the time. So yeah, I appreciate you jumping on and appreciate we finally getting to meet and talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Matt, I'm gonna have Matt just walk through. I know a lot. Well, actually, this will be a learning opportunity for me too as well. But why don't you kind of just update everybody kind of on the different experiences that you've had, kind of like, your paths and your stops along the way to kind of, get to where we are now.
Sure. So, athlete through high school, primary was baseball, went to San Diego State as a preferred walk-on kind of thing. That lasted about a month. Went to a Division III in Wisconsin, which is where I am now. Played baseball, basketball, golf. Sports psychology was not, this was last century. I'm dating myself. Sports psychology was not much of a thing then, but I kind of found an interest in it. And then I went back to San Diego State for my master's degree after I was finished playing. Played in the Northwoods Collegiate Wooden Bat League, and then went back to San Diego State for my master's in sports psych, and then helped out a little bit with the baseball team when I was there. So baseball is kind of the primary. Yeah. 2 years there, worked at IMG for a year doing baseball and golf at their academy, which was a great learning experience. So that finished up my master's degree in sports psych, which I thought I was going to be finished with just performance psych. Mm-hmm. But my experience at IMG said there's a gray area between mental health and performance psych, but I really wasn't qualified for, wasn't sure, didn't know what that was. Moved back to Wisconsin, took a teaching job, applied to a PhD program in counseling psych, and started my own practice doing sports performance work. 2005 was found by the Milwaukee Brewers to start doing assessments for their draft. So 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, I was doing work for the draft, and then I would work with their major league players kind of on the side. Yeah. 2010, they offered me a full-time job. So I was the director of the psych program. I did draft assessments and development programs, work with the major league team, and went through the minor leagues to help guys develop and get ready for the big leagues. Great experience. I think at that point in time, there were only a handful of people working in baseball full time for a team. And I was only the second psychologist that worked directly for a team. Yeah. It was amazing. And to have a small market franchise kind of buy in at that level was pretty sick at that point in time.
Yeah.
And starting in 2008, decent baseball team. And then 11 playoffs. And then about 40% of the time that I was there, we were in the playoffs, which was great for a small market team.
Yeah.
And then I stopped doing that 2 years ago. In 2016, I got approached by TaylorMade golf club manufacturer to do the same thing in golf, which starting out assessing their biggest guys and helping them identify talent younger in the amateur ranks for them to sign. So I finished my PhD in 2010. I thought that having a license was important for that gray area.
Yeah.
And then my bias over time has been I've watched data inform ATC, S&C, biomechanics, coaching, and I do not know why people haven't used it in psych. When I first got into baseball, it was you're putting dots on people and having them throw, and then you're understanding where the vectors are and where the stress angles are and all that kind of stuff. They did a really good job of defining areas and then learning from those areas. And in psych, they just have the term makeup, which I still don't even know what that means. So my work is really like defining what those variables are and finding out the correlations in those variables in high performers,
Yeah.
and like planning those things out longitudinally over time, which I've kind of done for 25 years. That was a long summary. Sorry about that.
No, it was good. No, and definitely some different areas that I wanted to dive into. One of the first ones that you brought up is, what did you notice, like before you went back for your PhD? You said you started noticing some gray areas, and what inconsistencies did you start to see that you're just like, man, there's got to be more to this. I'm missing something. What were those things that you started to identify?
Yeah, so one of the first meetings I had was with nobody will know who this is, and I won't give enough background, but a parent and a child of a 14-year-old kid. And the parent said, my goal is to have my child be the first person from this country to ever win Wimbledon. And I had just watched this kid get killed by like a 8-year-old girl, like earlier in the day. And just like the pressure that kid felt, the family dynamic, like this thing was not going to get approached with teaching visualization and goal setting. Like there were some other pieces in here that I think were there that I knew that had to be addressed. And the one variable that probably hit me the most was anxiety. Like what I learned from my experience at IMG is that there's a lot of people with a high level of anxiety that are really high performing. And
That
if you put it,
just by the way, I was going to say, me and anxiety are great friends.
yeah,
So, I grew up very, very intimate with the guy anxiety. So, anyways,
yeah, and it's funny, like it is a great driver for preparation. It is a great driver for passion in a sport, and coaches tend to like love people that are like that. And this guy's got a huge motor, and blah 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 blah. And some people harness it, some people don't. But what I was noticing, to answer your question specifically, is like this would be a diagnosable level of anxiety in the general population.
yeah,
It's still diagnosable within this athlete, but it's a high performing athlete. So like that interplay was kind of that gray area that made me super curious to go and learn a little bit more about it and get into an actual like counseling program.
Well, and that's where I wanted to bring that up too. And I'm happy it kind of went this direction. You kind of walked into the web. Is one of the things that I noted for at the time. First off, I think the other thing is as well, it's better nowadays for sure, but I've had to do so much work that I know a lot of people, the general public, is not going to do, to go and have a lot of this awareness of, again, we don't even label, I don't even know I'm having anxiety. Majority of my life, I didn't even know I was dealing with some of these things, right? So it's like, or like, even if you say things like depression and you're like, well, I'm not depressed. They're not, like it's just the check. It's just the check. It's not a spectrum. It's not a season. It's not a, there's none of these other things that I think that should be considered with different individuals. And then also, for example, I had, as you mentioned, really high levels of performance anxiety, which, yes, really drove me when I trained. I trained crazy because of some of this, right? But then when I got in game, I really underperformed based on, and I always talk about it like, and I know it's thrown around and probably watered down, and maybe you'd have a better way of explaining it, but like toxic motivation. It's still motivation. It just has a nasty byproduct that you have to deal with on the back end. And yeah, you're right. It got me through that moment. And my body like served me in that moment. Right. But it like also too, when compounded over time, and then also when you're like identity and all these other things that deal with it, which obviously, like you said, gets into a lot of the mental health in different areas and other things as well, is like, man, like, I went 0 for 4 today, so I'm bad. And I went 4 for 4 today, so I'm good now. And life is magical and everything's amazing, right? And then the other thing I would love, and I know we're going in some different directions. Another thing on my side of things, from training some of these higher level performers, right, that you've obviously been around for years and all these things, I think it's also said at the lower levels all the time that these major league athletes don't deal with these things. And
Yeah, which is not the case.
which is not the case. They're humans like the rest of us. And like you said, I've seen they'll say mentally tough, again, a very loose definition of what
Yep.
mentally tough even means, and makeup and all the things that I know we're going to get into. But I've had some major league athletes that I would say are some of the least mentally tough that I've had. Like I've had kid in, for example, like I've had high schooler that, you know what, he maybe wasn't as good and he never made it to that level, but also too, he didn't deal with the same issues, of course, right? We're all individuals. We all have our own things going on. But, there's some athletes that haven't had to really deal with, as they come up through those levels, man, they've dominated at every level of their entire life. And then all of a sudden they get to AAA. All of a sudden they get to the big leagues and they finally struggle and they finally have to sit the bench and they finally aren't the guy on the team and they're finally not this. Hey, I just dealt with that when I was in like high school. So a lot of other guys haven't had to deal with that until they get to really high levels. And I think that that's also a misnomer. And I would love for you to touch on that, right? Is like, we just think, oh man, this guy's an elite level performer. He doesn't deal with any of these things. He doesn't have any of those things. He's the most mentally tough guy, at every level. And I think that, there's so much out there that's, layered on that.
Yeah. That's a lot. Let me try to attack it in a way that I think I'm supposed to attack it, and then we can kind of dovetail from there.
Yeah.
So, I think in my perception, my conceptualization of this, like the brain is going to maximize what the body can do.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're growing up in the middle of Iowa, no offense to Iowa, 75% vowels, 100% amazing. Like if you're growing up in Iowa and you're throwing 95 and you're not playing a whole lot of competition, to your point, like you're not having to develop resilience. You're not having to develop visualization. You're not having to develop goal setting. You're not having to develop any of these skills because you just roll out of the rack and you're fine.
Yeah.
And the truth is there are those people out there. And I do actually, after doing this for so long, I do feel bad for them, because if you don't have to develop these until the lights are the brightest, like it's almost you're almost 3 steps behind. When I was working in baseball, I really wanted somebody to deal with a lot of failure before they got to Double A, probably before they got out of Double A.
Yeah.
Because then they weren't in the spotlight so much. Like AAA, you're a step away. You really have to have it kicked into you. Like you develop some of these skills in a place where you give time to develop. You're not really pushing it so much. If you look at like the quote unquote gritty players, like the grinder baseball players, they're the ones that were maximizing their skill set when they were freshmen in college, and they learned how to do that, and they just kind of take it up the next level, and everybody kind of cheers for those guys.
Yeah.
I think the best examples of this in my mind are what I think is probably the toughest position in sport, which is NFL quarterback.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the ones that are like Hall of Fame, I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, like Hall of Fame level quarterbacks. I don't know these people like intimately. It's just outside looking in.
Yeah.
Tom Brady didn't start in college.
Yeah.
Drew Brees came out of Texas, and all those Texas programs passed on him. He had to go to the Big Ten.
Yeah.
Aaron Rodgers, JC.
Yeah.
Like you look at a lot of these guys, like they had to deal with that like early on in their career, develop the chip on the shoulder, learned how to like do those things, and then was able to transition to the next level. I feel bad for the ones that haven't had to do that and that had to go to the next level, because it's just a whole different animal.
Yeah. And I think you hit a perfect note there too, is the other part, right? Right. Is like, look at even like Michael Jordan or somebody like that, right? Okay, I get cut, from my high school team, or, different dynamics in there. Or, for example, you mentioned a couple quarterbacks that came into the league and were backups for multiple years before they're sitting the bench every year, not just, with that. And then also the different dynamic within baseball, where it's like, I get drafted. Well, and it's changing a little bit now, but a lot of guys would get drafted and it's like, yo, you get this big highlight, everybody signs, everybody parties, and then you don't see you for 6 years before you ever even get to the bigs. Right. And so there's all these other dynamics where it's like, again, it's not like other sports where immediately you're on TV,
Yeah.
immediately you're getting reps at the highest level when, in reality, it's very different. And then as you mentioned too, again, having to overcome that. And I actually thought it was interesting. One of the words you used there is like developing a chip and how that actually plays out. And I'm sure there's some other things, but I know one of the things that you really wanted to touch on, and before we get into a lot of this high level verbiage that's thrown around, I think it leads us right into the point of when we start talking about like with makeup, right? We say this, makeup and scouting and all these things, and you've already noted it before. Yeah, let's start diving into there of like, what that's
Means.
to and what that actually means, and that not just some higher level verbiage we throw around and just, water down everything.
Yeah. So I hate the word makeup because as I would go through a scouting meeting or a manager's meeting or a player development meeting, like they all had different definitions of the term.
Yeah.
What I tended to learn over time is a scout wanted a guy that was probably not going to cause problems, but then could be a major league player. Like that's what makeup meant to that guy. So that he could choose this guy. Like those conversations would be, hey, this guy, I think this guy was hungover during our home visit. Is it a problem? And then it was like, is this guy going to be confident? Is this guy competitive enough to make it to the big leagues? Like that's what makeup meant to the scouts.
Yeah.
Managers, like they want a guy that's not going to cause them problems. They look towards leadership skills, open-mindedness. Are you going to follow the rules?
Yeah.
Will you listen to what I have to say?
Which I thought it was interesting what you just said, right? When they're talking about leadership, the problem is most leaders are the most unagreeable. Like they want to like do their own thing. They want to lead the show. They want to take it on. So it's like trying to herd cats sometimes. Like when you get a real leader, a lot of times they want to lead. So they're the ones that push back the most a lot of the times, and a different side of things, but John Maxwell, he has his like levels of leadership. I'm sure you have some other things, right? Some higher level things. But one of the things that I grab in there I thought was really important and to help me when I was developing other leaders is to identify that and say, hey, yeah, you know what? They could be a problem or they could be our leader on the team, depending on how you treat them and how you, utilize that skill set that they have to influence other people. And so it's interesting when you say leadership and managers are identifying these people and it's like, hey, I just want them to like not be a problem. It's like, or just agree or just do everything I want them to do. But like, that's a different, they don't line up as much.
No, and line up is the right phrase for me. Like it's when you get into those things, it's so much of a fit. Like again, I don't know Phil Jackson. I wasn't involved in the Bulls or any of the Bulls players, but from the outside looking in, like he's kind of a laissez-faire, like I'm going to pull the strings, but I need an alpha dog in the room to like do things.
Mm-hmm.
You had Jordan, who seemed like an alpha dog. You had Kobe, who seemed like an alpha dog. Like,
Yeah.
if you have that style, we're all good.
Yeah.
If you've got, like, my guess is Ozzie Guillen and Michael Jordan wouldn't have loved each other.
No. Or for example, great example within basketball, LeBron James has pushed quite a few coaches like out, like you got to have a certain coach that can work with LeBron at this point. And he like, he's going to be that alpha, run the team. If you try to like dominate him and try to, you guys go head to head. Yeah. Like Ozzie Guillen or something like that. Like that's probably not going to be a great fit for those two guys.
Yeah. So those clubhouse variables, so I call them you with others variables. Like those variables are dynamic and they change based on the environment. Like I think you can also look at college sports now. Like the control freak coaches cannot get out of college jobs quick enough right now.
Yeah.
And the people that are more individualized and understand like a group dynamic and are willing to let people take leadership roles and blah, 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 blah. Those guys have kind of come into the coaching ranks and found themselves in positions of success. They're more democratic with how they go about with their businesses. So kind of getting back to where we started with makeup, like it's so hard when you do group dynamic variables, what I call the you with others variables, because a lot of it has to do with like the fit of the system. And this, I'll give you the very specific example of where this hit me. I was sitting with our Gordash was the name of the guy that hired me with the Brewers, and he was the assistant GM. And he was a guy that started as a clubhouse attendant, like this is the old school way to do it, and then moved himself up to GM of the Toronto Blue Jays, and then assistant GM of that.
Yeah.
Don't happen anymore.
No, that's crazy.
And he grabbed me one day because we were talking about leadership for like a month, and he was talking to the Toronto Maple Leafs GM, and the phrase that he heard from that guy was, "I don't need any more leaders. I need followers."
Mm.
And if you have too many alphas in the room, like
Too many Indians, too many Chiefs.
it's really hard. So I'll give you a specific example of how I look at this kind of secret sauce ways from my education in psych. So I worked in addiction, and I would do we would do group talks, and there was kind of rules that I was trained in group talks. So you got 12 people around, see who's talking the most, see who relates to other people, see how people react, and kind of like I was responsible to like draw out where everybody's sitting in the room, and then draw lines between people who were talking to each other, and people who had influence in the group. And that was the guy that was training me. That was his way of telling me, like, that's how you identify how the group dynamic is. Like, whoever has the most lines to them is your leader. And it's not going to be just one person in the room. It's probably going to be multiple people. On a baseball team, you need somebody who's a position player, and somebody who's a pitcher, and you need somebody here, and you need somebody this, and it all has to kind of work together. Like, that's really hard, and analytics isn't doing that really well right now.
Yeah.
But it is a piece of makeup that seems to matter. And one more thing on this, and I'll put it back to you. But if you look at the teams that have won World Series over this age of analytics, it's a lot of old baseball guys as managers.
For sure.
That kind of get how to manage that clubhouse. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, what's the correlation in your head there?
Like, I think they know how to manage that you with others kind of dynamic, and they know how to push a button the right way, and when to bring a guy aside as a veteran, and they kind of value that veteran leadership piece because that helps the room.
Yeah.
And I believe me, analytics has done an unbelievable job of predicting who's going to get to the playoffs.
Yeah.
But I think the old school managers that have that understanding of the makeup of a clubhouse have had success once they get there.
Yeah.
Because they know their guys, they know how to push them, they know how to get the right buttons, they know how to make the room work for itself.
And some context that I would love to add there too as well. It's not just the old school coaches, it's the really good old school or older, coaches, right? So it's like also survivor bias, like that other thing, right? Like they're the Della Creme, right? That's why they're still around. That's why they're still in the game, is they're really good coaches. And if they weren't really good coaches, just because they're older doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best coaches, right? It's their skill set is diverse. They have a lot of experience, and they've learned how to win, and that's why they're still in the game in the first place.
Yeah, so, no doubt.
Yeah, so I think that's huge, like you said. And I got the opportunity to spend some time around Dusty Baker there for a little bit, his I think second to last year. And we trained some players on the team and some other things. So I got to spend some weeks traveling here and there. And same thing, yeah, just like you said, just again, it's so interesting because some people would consider that, and we're going to talk about roles here in a minute and like what things.
Yeah.
Some people consider that coaching. And then if you're in a private facility like mine, like you're not coaching, or if you're not doing this, like you're not coaching. If you're not a skill coach, you're like, if you're in the, if you're the strength coach, like there's different roles that coaches share, even though we're underneath the same title. Right. And, and again, you could say, okay, well, that's managing, right? They try to give it another title, right? Well, he's managing. He's not necessarily the skill coach. Right. And, again, that's really where I saw Dusty really play, as you mentioned. And also I know some, other coaches as well. I mean, obviously if you look at Texas, like
very similar there, right? As they kind of have these dynamics, is like you usually see this older coach, but then man, the coaches underneath him, right? The skilled coaches are actually some of the most progressive in the game. Everybody forgets that, right?
Absolutely.
So look, these
Yeah.
guys are winning all these games and they got the oldest coach, but it's like, yeah, but if you look at that staff is some of the most progressive coaches in the game that are really good at teaching skills, identifying patterns, helping out their athletes. And that mixture of both can be a really good, as you mentioned, like that system works really well together. If
Really
you
well.
only have all of this or you only have all of that, it's like having a team full of only 4-hole hitters. Everybody's a 4-hole guy and they're striking
Yeah.
on and like, no, I need a guy to, get on. I need a guy to cause some, congestion on the base paths and make some things happen. And then I need, like that team dynamic of how we actually score as a unit rather than just everybody trying to be the same type or do the same things.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. One of the phrases that pops in my head when you're talking is like diversity of thought usually leads to conflict, but better decision making.
Mm,
And getting all those people in the room with those different perspectives. Even
yeah.
I don't know Theo Epstein, and I wasn't around when he came with the Cubs, but when he's bringing this thing in, he's still bringing older veteran guys into the room.
Yeah.
And wanting multiple different perspectives on it, because you know that's going to lead to that tends to lead to better decision making at the end of the day.
And when you go, obviously, which I know you spend a lot of time outside even the sports space and how it gets applied across the board, right? Is you look at like Amazon, for example, they were known for having everybody come to the meeting and it's like, we'll meet for the next 3 weeks and argue about this, right? And go back and forth and debate and everybody present their own ideas and bring their own examples. And we're going to sit here until we come to a conclusion that we all feel confident on because this decision, for example, let's say you're going to start, we're not going to use USPS, FedEx, all these other people. We're going to start our own multi-billion-dollar delivery, system that has never existed before. Well, yeah, you know what? I want a lot of input on here and I want to make sure we get this right because if we make a mistake on this, it's going to lead to some, terrible things for this company. And having,
it's funny that you bring that up because my wife worked for UPS and about 15 years ago, she's an industrial engineer. 15 years ago, one of her colleagues left for Amazon, and we all kind of questioned it, like, "What are you doing for this startup company?" And he ended up designing their truck.
Wow!
Like all those decisions on designing what that truck is, and he's doing okay. He's not eating a lot of Kraft products right now.
Yeah, I bet he's doing all right. Yeah, that's funny. No, and with that, right, as well. Okay, so we say the word makeup, but some of the things, and obviously from a high level view, and again, I'm going to spill the beans here a little bit as well. I loved how humble you were in the beginning when you explained to everybody who TaylorMade was. TaylorMade is one of the, one of the premier companies, again, to be associated, and
they make good products.
Yeah, they make some good things. Also, along with that, they came to you, and also too, one of the ways that you serve in there, and also too, as you served within the draft and some of the alignments there, was to get away from this surface level word of makeup, but also start to define what it actually is and what are, and have some context to these different layers. And also it's not just this, and this isn't the only way to do it. And there is some differences here and there's some nuances and all of those things, but they tasked you, I know, with some things that kind of led you to what you're, where you guys are kind of doing some things today. So I kind of also wanted to bring that up for you to kind of talk about that experience and,
sure.
Kind of unpacking how you started to unpack what the word makeup means and performance and what that actually, is.
So I'll be very specific on the front end. So the psych assessment that I used first was called the TACE. It's the Attentional Interpersonal Style Inventory. It was made by a guy in San Diego where I grew up in the 70s. And that's kind of what I use. It measured like 17 different variables. And it's what I started using when I went across the board. And then things like that probably are common to your listeners, like the idea of grit. So Duckworth's work on one variable that seemed to correlate with high performers.
Yeah.
Then you look at growth mindset, which comes out of Stanford. And I'll be very specific about growth mindset, even though I wasn't working in the organization, but like it makes sense to me if they were using it. Like the Houston Astros changed how they did development and of players. So they needed players to come into their system. And again, I wasn't there. I'm just outside looking in, so I'm guessing here. Like they wanted people with growth mindset because they wanted people who were going to be open enough to like throw a heavy ball around or put a sensor on their bat. And so like that's a specific psych variable to the fit of an organization that they were looking for because they were looking for that type of guy to come through their organization. And so I'm looking at like some people look at one variable and I was looking at a bunch of variables and sometimes the outcomes weren't great and sometimes the front office didn't like it and sometimes, but I'm still learning because I'm able to assess a bunch of guys, 500, maybe between 300 and 500 guys for the draft, depending on the year. And then I watch them go through my leagues. And then I talk to people in other organizations and you look at how it goes. And theoretically, like through that process and then my work with other athletes on the side and TaylorMade and everything like that, like I came down to like there's three kind of general areas of psych variables. The first area is just the straight performance variables. So are you confident? Are you competitive? Can you concentrate? Do you have a long-term approach? Do you control your distractions? Like those variables directly correlate with how good somebody is at task X. And those are pretty well researched variables that I could find assessments for. Then it was the group dynamic variables that some of them there were good assessments for, and some of them there kind of weren't. Like how much do you want to be in control of your world? How perfectionistic are you? What's your improvement style? Like, do you follow rules? And maybe my favorite one that I made up was, do you have a good filter for taking in information that you think applies to you or not?
Yeah, that's good.
Those are the kind of like the group dynamic variables that I saw. And then I had some internal process variables, which are more related to motivation and how high your motor is. So I call them motor, self-criticism, how well you control your emotions. And then do you approach things from a mastery orientation, trying to be really good at it? Or do you approach things from a dominant orientation, which is, do I want to just go out there and beat the piss out of people? So what I did over the years was I collected information on all these and I threw them into factor analysis and then like what kind of stuck together and what didn't stick together. And those are the three areas where they stuck together. Performance variables, group dynamic, what I call you with others variables, and then the internal, which I call you with you variables. And some of them correlate with performance better than others.
Yeah.
And some of them depend on the fit of the system. But I didn't find a magic bullet. But I found a bunch of categories and different things that I think help us understand who the athlete is and really help them pick which intervention works for them. I hope I explained that well enough.
Yeah, no, and I think you also started to open up the can of worms that the reason that I've even seen this from the opposite side of this of one, we're working with so many athletes. Like for example, I've had some of my best players be note takers, be so attentive, be, so agreeable, do everything I say. And then I've had some of my best players be the complete opposite. Like, don't take notes on anything, are very hard to talk to, not very agreeable at all, all of those other things. And then obviously everything in between. Right. And so, and so with that, as you say, when we say like the word like makeup, I think what the wisdom of it, even though it gets lost with per thing, is that it's a grouping of things like for lack of other words, not just like an algorithm, but it's a independent. It works for you because of X, Y, and Z. And, again, obviously with that, it doesn't mean that there isn't any correlations. It doesn't mean that there isn't any insight. It doesn't mean that there isn't any of those other things. But as you mentioned too, as we talked about, a big piece was with like different coaches and with experience, I better now. It's not that yes, of course, we keep driving and understanding movement better and all those other things. But more than anything now, one, as I've learned more about myself, I've also learned more about others. I've also been able to see them more clearly because I get myself out of the way and all those other things that we talked about beforehand. I go to therapy every single week. Again, there's a lot of things that I'll do outside to like gain awareness of those things. But also too, the other parts with that as well is if I can see more clearly what's going on with them, well, as Randy Sullivan says over at Florida Baseball Armory, he'll say, know your athlete. And while that's
Yeah.
vague and high level, but it's again, the better I understand them, the better I can coach them, which is obviously a major variable. And again, they're not all the same and they don't need to
No.
be to perform at a very high level. And I think that that's also a major thing where a lot of people are trying to clone mindsets for the whole team. I want us all to be
Yeah.
super gritty. I want us all to be note takers. I want us all to be this X, Y, and Z, right? And it's like, well, again, that's not true for everybody across the board.
So two responses to that, and I appreciate those insights. One of the things I learned early in my educational process is at a stats class, and they talked about actuarial data, which is numbers, versus clinical impression, which is an interview that some professional might have with somebody. It was clear, like over the years, like there are some people that are good at this, that the clinical impressions, they can ask questions and have a conversation and figure out what's going on. But the actuarial data in psych versus the clinical impressions, like the actuarial data would win 4 to 6 to 1, like between 4 or 6 to like. And I've been around a lot of people. I think I'm pretty good at observing, but there's things that get in the way. Like culturally, a Dominican player might express something different than a kid that grew up in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't grow up in either of those places. So I'm looking at a behavior and I'm interpreting it as being something.
Yeah.
And it's not. So I changed up my process, I think I'm getting to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Where I ended up not even knowing who the person was. They took the questionnaire before I met with them.
Yeah.
So none of my bias would get in the way of this.
Yeah.
And getting back to the beginning of this, like I think S&C and ATC and biomechanics has done such a good job of like getting to there are people you could sit there and look at a ball come out of the hand and know what a spin rate is, and you might be that good. And there are golf coaches who I could sit with, and they're going to know from the sound of hitting the club, like, did I miss it? Did I flush it? Was it spinny? Like all this stuff. Awesome. Like I'm not that good.
Yeah.
Like for me, if you really want to understand the player, it's not because I'm talking to them. It's really because I'm getting an understanding of them with data. The second thing is what I've come with those 5 performance variables to conceptualize and to think about them is I'm starting to treat them like 5 tools for a player. Like there are some guys that get to the big leagues because they can hit for contact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there are some guys that get to the big leagues because they can run. Out of these 5 variables for the performance, there are some guys that get to the big leagues because they're competitive as hell. There are some guys that get to the big leagues because you can't do much to shake their confidence. There's some guys that get to the big leagues because they're so focused. And the quality of player in the big leagues from a physical standpoint could be because they have 2 or 3 tools. And from a mental standpoint, they might have 2 or 3 tools. But there are guys that get there because they are, to your point, the most diligent, obsessive note taker in the world. They will not miss anything, and that's how they get there. And there are other guys that are diligent and confident at the same time, and then they stick around a little bit longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess I would challenge your learners to start thinking about it in the same way. Like there are multiple ways to get there, and multiple ways that individuals do it. The best of the best get there with all of the 5 tools. And the same is true probably for their mindset approach too.
Yeah. I think that's good. And then also, I think it kind of gets us into the other realm that we were talking about as well is, you hear all these titles thrown around, right? You got counselors and psychologists and coaches and they're titles on titles and titles and titles, right? But a lot of times we lump them all together the general community lumps them all together and go, I like, again, if I'm going to see a counselor, well, what's the difference between the counselor and a therapist or a mental performance coach? Or, there's all these different titles, and a lot of times we associate them all together. And we talk a lot about this with now that it's been great that more universities are taking on more of these roles, right? But the only thing is even sometimes our players, and it happens a ton. Like we had an athlete that had a major surgery that happened at the beginning of the fall, right? And so he's not playing right now, right? And then I'm like, hey, be a great time. I knew I've been pushing him this direction. Said, hey, it might be a great time for you to start meeting with somebody and doing the thing. And they sent him to a mental performance coach, and I'm like, I don't think it's a mental performance thing that I was more talking about. Like he has some major performance anxieties that I was more like looking at, and I identify just from coaching him all the time and all the things. And anyways, let's kind of talk into that of
Sure.
how that, we kind of get in that messy middle there.
You're pretty good at the timing of introducing this topic as to later in the pod, so we don't bore people right at the beginning. So I'll try to make this as quick and as easy as possible, because I know it's not the most exciting topic, but I think it is important. So I appreciate you bringing it up. So my path, I would never recommend my path to somebody because it was so stupid and so time consuming, and I spent way too much money in school, and I couldn't start my life until 30. But there is a path of a master's level sport performance path that doesn't allow you a license, that doesn't allow you knowledge of psych assessments, but you can teach mental skills, the visualization, the mindfulness, the relaxation. Like you can teach what those skills are. There's a really good value to that. I wanted more depth. So if you want more depth, kind of like going to the doctor versus going to the strength and conditioning, like you should still probably have a doctor check it before you go to strength and conditioning and kind of like check the box. So I personally am of the bias where I had everything from the performance to the mental health and then the gray area in between. So you've got a mental performance coach that really has there's kind of a license to that, but there's no oversight for it. And there's definitely no confidentiality in that.
Yeah.
Then you've got the mental health providers who you can go get a mental health license after a master's degree. Call yourself a therapist, and you could do both of those. You can be qualified to do the sports psychology and the sports performance and the therapist and do that gray area a little bit too. And then you have your psychologists that are trained, like to use the word psychologist, you have to have a PhD in psychology. And then to use the word licensed psychologist, you have to have a PhD and a license in psychology, which is kind of the highest level, which I don't think everybody has to go to, but that person knows how to use data. They've been trained in multiple different modalities.
Yeah.
That's what I think people should use as their gold standard for like where I should go. And if the psychologist says this is a therapist thing, go see a therapist. If it says it's a sports performance thing, then go see a sports performance therapist or sports performance specialist, I should say. Because the God's honest truth is there's only like 9 mental skills to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And the secret sauce for me is the data that teaches you which skill you're supposed to use. But you should probably go to somebody who's trained in using psych data to really find that out. I hope that was a short enough explanation, but provided enough depth.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. And why don't you also talk, and I think would be big is I think a lot of, you can go through all of that and then also different areas. I think some coaches can struggle with trying to play a role that is not their role, right? And like specifically in there. So what is a coach's role from your perspective comparatively to when they need to be able to identify, hey, you need to go see a higher level of care and I'm the first step here? How do you define that?
Super hard and takes a ton of trust.
Yeah.
Like, let's be honest, a lot of coaches, like they stay coaches because they keep their relationships with players, and sometimes it's because they're really good at teaching the swing, and sometimes it's because they have a good like relationship with the player. I always struggled with this piece of this because I didn't want to insert myself into the relationship with the player. Mm-hmm. But My company is called North of Your Neck because I thought that was the dividing line. um, like the coaches kind of do everything south of the neck, and then north of the neck is kind of what the sports performance slash psychologist does.
Hmm.
But to be very honest, I would spend a lot of time with coaches and talking about players and then educating them as to where that line was. Like if they start talking about being super anxious or super depressed or a family relationship, like how can we manage you being able to keep the relationship with the player, having them talk to me, and then still do your job? And it took a lot of trust from medical staff, training staff, um, the whole kit and caboodle to do that. I have come to respect coaches that know like where that, maybe not where the line is, but when you're feeling out where that line might be, and then we're willing to work collaboratively and say like, hey, you could talk to Matt. Matt might not give me a whole lot of feedback. If you want Matt to tell me what you're talking about, that'd be great. But you can go to Matt in a trusting environment, and if Matt said anything, he's going to get fired and sued and lose his license. Um, I would love to educate more coaches on these different definitions of the variables, but then also educate them as to like, hey, there's probably a point in time where we could all sit down and have a conversation, and that probably relates to when there's a significant amount of anxiety, if they're talking about things that are related to like sadness, and if there's any sort of family issue or off the course field pitch issue.
Yeah.
It takes a ton of trust, and quite frankly, that's why it's easier when I'm outside an organization to do it than when you try to do it inside an organization. Like you have that same experience yourself, I assume.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think it can be big. Obviously, with that, right, is like I think sometimes at every different level, it's like when you know where your line is, right? Even, and I don't think there's a general line and then there's a personal line, I feel like, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
hey, like it's outside of my standard, like what or my level of care. But again, there could be somebody still below, the psychologist line that could help you. It's just not me, you know?
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of, it can get layered, right? Of all the reasons,
Absolutely.
all the things. But I do think that, for example, like, and sometimes I like to provide extremes so that people can wrap their heads around this. Like, if somebody is struggling with schizophrenia, like, okay, like, yo, above my level of care, like,
Yeah.
above my level of care, that one's a little bit more clear. Like, okay, there's some things that are really going on here above my level of care. But sometimes it gets, like you said, a little bit more nuanced of, they start trusting you. They start building a relationship with you as a coach, right? And then especially me on the private side, I have a different relationship because I'm not right.
Yeah.
I'm not writing the lineup, right? I'm just on your team, right?
Yep.
So I have a different relationship with my athletes. And then also too, every year they're bringing in a new coach. You're one choosing for me to be your coach. And then I also can stay with you from level to level to level. So I have a different relationship with athletes than a lot of other coaches have as well. That's what I was trying to say is like, even though we're both coaches, we might have a different, I'm going to have a very different relationship generally with athletes compared to those other type of roles.
Yeah. On one end of the spectrum, I would always make this joke with our minor league pitching coordinator. Like if I knew I was going to get fired, um, an athletic trainer can call time when somebody grabs their elbow and make a mound visit. Like I was out, if I knew I was going to get fined, like I was going to call time if I thought a guy was losing his concentration to make a mound visit. Um, like that's one end of the spectrum that I'm not looking to do. But if you're in the cage and the guy takes a swing and his shoulder is like not right,
Yeah.
like the coach throwing BP is like, why don't you go to training room, just get checked out, just make sure you're good.
Yeah.
I think it should be the same thing. Like, hey, why don't you just go, just get checked out, just make sure you're good, and then come back. And I'm treating a lot of this like the same way the medical staff does. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just a check just to make sure you're good. And if coaches do that and there's a trusting relationship, I've seen it work wonders.
Yeah. And I think obviously with that, the other thing is I think it's important for me, for example, if I'm going to send somebody to a higher level of care, I think also the openness and also the modeling, I think is important also as well. They trust me. Like, for example, when
I've sent some athletes to some higher levels of care. Well, I already go to therapy, right? I go to therapy every single week. I believe in it. My director of ops, Taylor, she served at multiple facilities and ran multiple facilities for addiction and all those things. It's been a big part of her life. She has degrees in different things, right? But again, largely too as well, like mental performance and counseling, and like again, some family within her master's. Forgot exactly what her degree was called, and for her master's within some of that counseling and stuff. But again, specifically, for me as a coach as well, I'm coaching that athlete, and every time they don't hit a ball well, they're like, their self-talk immediately goes into, I'm terrible, I suck, I'm, whatever that line me, right? Sometimes even within my coaching, like I'll catch them right there and start giving them some awareness and be like, like, and also my play on this as well is I'm like, hey, you're talking to my favorite player like that. Like, don't talk like that. Like, like
Yeah.
and I bring it, and then I bring it up. I also bring it up, right? I also bring it up like, hey, if anybody else was talking to you that way, I would talk to them. I'd be like, hey, like you probably wouldn't be good friends with that person.
No, not at all.
How you talk to yourself and like how you do those other things. And what I mean by that right there as well, right, is like there's an arena there of I know where I can coach and I can do something, right? And then also there's a time where I'm like, yo, like, dude, this kid's dad just died, right? And you know what? My hand on the shoulder and like, tell him if he needs anything, I'm here and all the things. But at the same time, that's a whole nother scenario, right? Where if I start identifying or I start picking up on some things of like, man, something's off, even if I don't know what it is, right? I don't need to know exactly what it is, right? Like something's off. His personality has, really, taken a left here. He's showing up, I'm noticing some things. He's, all of a sudden now he's usually dressing this way. He's really dressing, little things that I think could be useful as well for coaches to start identifying these things and take advantage of some of these resources that some of these schools are now really advancing on, and obviously professional organizations.
Yeah, the good thing about the universities is everybody at the university level in the counseling center is licensed.
Yeah.
Like they've taken that approach. I wish Major League Baseball has taken that approach, but they haven't. But if you go to the university level, like all those people, if you go to their counseling center, they're going to have some sort of license.
Yeah.
You bring up another point that I think is important when it comes to mental health that I have to be honest, I've run into, and I also have struggled with dealing with when I'm working with an organization and people that have to perform. So I really like military literature in psych and performance. And if you look at how the military does it, like they will debrief after a tour and make them kind of stay away and process everything after things are done. They don't necessarily process them in the field. And if you compare that to how we do things medically, like I might have a ligament strain and I go to the doctor and the doctor says like, well, this might be surgery after the season, but he's not going to do any more damage to it now. So let's develop a program for him. Let's strengthen the muscles. Let's get through the next month.
Yeah.
And then we'll evaluate at the end of the season, but there's a good chance at the end of the season he has surgery.
Yeah.
I think everybody has a black box in them where they store all their crap.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, it's oftentimes not advantageous to open that up when you're in a performance environment.
Yeah. Definitely not the same
for anybody.
Yeah.
But I've had multiple conversations with players where it's been like, okay, there's something in here, people are seeing it. Like, do you want to open it up right now? No. I totally get that.
Yeah.
Like you're functional. You have to do your job. Like there's no harm to anybody like in what's going on. But will you promise me as soon as the season's over, I'm going to give you a call 3 days after the season's over and let's just have a conversation, see where this is at. Like I think people think that if you go to a therapist, like their first job is to open up every deepest, darkest secret. And if you are bawling by the end of it, like and you leave the office, like we are totally happy and we give ourselves a high five.
Oh my God.
And that's not the case. I think when you're working in this environment, what I learned from the embedded psychologists in military environments is you can identify something And you can identify, like, I'm going to watch this and make sure that this person has enough care, but we have a plan for it at the end. And the same can happen with what you're talking about in those environments, performance environments, where people compartmentalize really well. Our job is to make sure they're still functional. They know that you're there, but then have a plan when things end where you can actually address some of the issues when it's a safer environment where you probably have more chance to actually input change than during a season. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really good, and some things for us to keep in mind, with it. And when you go, specifically like kind of weaving back the opposite way, obviously I kind of brought all this is I think that there's resources, right? Not only that are you developing and these other things that you're as well. And I know that along with it, as we're kind of wrapping through, is I wanted you kind of touch on some of the things and the resources that you started developing. And I know that you have some really powerful tools, which is why even different sports have now started to lean in some different ways of utilizing some of these things that you've developed over the years, and also what you're doing now as well. So I kind of wanted to give one, to educate me on what those things are that you what are available, and then also two, some of the cool things that you're working on.
Um, Easiest way to do it is this way, because this is my note in my office.
Yeah.
So, over time, when I collect data, what I start to do is like identify what type of brain people have, and then which intervention works for them.
Mm.
So the interventions are pretty easy. It's goal setting, time management, self-talk, mindfulness, which is becoming very popular, routines, breathing process, visualization, compartmentalization, and learning how to kind of reframe your environment. Like, if you look at all the interventions in the performance psych literature, you put them in buckets, it's probably those 9 buckets.
Yeah, no, I've never seen it laid out like that. That's good. That's interesting.
Now we could sit around and I could argue with people all day long about, is this a pure bucket, or like the mindfulness people would be like, our mindfulness incorporates breathing. That's fine. I'm not looking to fight in those areas.
Yeah.
But what I really like, when I opened up a psych textbook, it was, this is the condition, this is the treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And right now in the psych space, oftentimes what I get mad about is the intervention that is often taught to the person by a coach or a mental performance coach or whatever is usually the one that works for them in the past. They're like, you just need to set goals. And I think as a field, we're falling a little bit behind because we haven't linked the brain with the interventions very well. So I'm in the process of trying to do that. I finally got the variables defined, and I think I have an algorithm that, with the assessment, that starts identifying which brains respond to which types of interventions well. And hopefully by the middle of summer, I can get that a little bit public. But I've been using it internally for quite a while now, and I'm almost ready to take it public with an assessment and possibly an app that follows up with some training with AI.
Nice. Yeah. And then also, I think that you thought, you said some things that I thought were interesting there. You hit some nails on the head for me. Is, for example, setting goals early in my life was a major thing for me. But, and again, you might have some ways of unpacking this or helping me unpack it. For me, I had a major switch. Like, for example, like when for my faith, like as my faith switched, right? Goal setting changed dramatically. Yeah. And so, for me, like I started following more like paths, right? It was like, hey, I'm going to go this way, but I can't see everything. I'm just going to get to this corner, and then it will show me more. And then I'll get to that corner, and it will show me, it'll show me more. Right. And then so and also I think at different areas of people's life, I know, like, for example, like Taylor is massive on setting goals. It's very important for her. Journaling is very important for her, all those things. And also too, at a certain time in my life, journaling was major, right? And again, I still do it, just not as much. Some seasons I do it more, some seasons I do it less. Some seasons I read more, some seasons I read less. Some seasons I'm in more communities, and communities were a major impact on, some of that awareness. And some seasons therapy and how much I was going to therapy was major, right?
And so I think that that's also another thing too, as well. And I wanted to kind of throw back to you is after your assessments and all those things, and you go through how for you, how important is it, and how often are you looking at reassessment, and how often are you looking at like that as things progress, as things change, as life events?
Yeah.
What does that look like for you?
Usually with my clients, it's once a year we'll do an assessment.
Hmm.
Over time, what I've learned is, so I have norm groups for golfers, baseball players, like, so you kind of hit the standard deviation or you don't, and then we kind of look at a full picture and look at where you're at. Um, Usually you don't move like more than one standard deviation, even with training.
Hmm.
Like at some level, especially as you get older, you kind of like, you are what you are, but
Hmm.
that doesn't mean like, hey, my self-talk has come down. So my self-criticism has come down, so I don't have to work on my self-talk as much. But now, like, I'm finding myself a little bit trouble with concentration, so let's throw a little bit of mindfulness in there.
Hmm.
And so, to answer your question, it was usually about once a year that I do an evaluation.
Hmm.
Um, the older that we get, the more stable that they tend to be. The younger that we are, the more variable, and that's consistent across all psych assessments
Yeah.
and probably a lot of physical assessments too.
Yeah.
But it could be that the algorithm just, it's mindfulness one time, it's goal setting the next, it's this, it's that. Um, and people do change with that kind of stuff. And sometimes we just like the newness of it too.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's just like I need something that's a little bit different. So
Yeah.
to answer your question directly, it's usually once a year. And if I got a developing athlete that really killed an intervention, maybe it's once every 6 months, but probably once every year.
Hmm. How much do, and I know this might be again a different in different spheres as well, right? Where of influence is specifically, let's say, obviously traumas happen throughout our lives, and things we
Yeah.
experience and all these other things as well. How much of those, like a major trauma or other things, how does that impact? I know obviously it impacts different areas, and we can go. That's a whole nother thing on.
Yeah.
But I'm saying specifically these things that you're looking as well in your experience. How have you seen like those things impact that part of our brain, or how we're on the performance side of those different areas?
You mean if a trauma happens in the moment or previous trauma or both?
Yeah, maybe I was specifically talking about, like, let's say we do an assessment, right? And then something majorly, I experienced some major trauma, right? Or X, Y, and Z. How have you seen that change, in those specific areas? Or is it similar, still very that within that
Yeah.
standard deviation, or how have you seen it kind of affect there?
Yeah. So it changes the system. It's funny, like if you're a good compartmentalizer, it won't change the data right away, but it'll change it when you open up the box
Mm,
6 months, a year later.
yeah.
Um, it's and trauma is a word that's used a lot. Like that could be a variety of things in
Yeah.
today's world.
Yeah.
What I am finding, which is sad, is that trauma is more prevalent than I ever thought it would have been when I started this field. And sometimes it just pops up. That's why I asked you the question about previous trauma versus current.
Yeah.
Um, I think my easiest way to answer this question is um, any transition in life like tends to bring up stuff.
Yeah.
So it could be as like the two most stressful life events are loss of a child and moving.
Mm, mm,
Like even the simple act of moving, like if you're in a house for 20 years and you've got to like start cleaning stuff up, it's straight Christmas vacation upstairs watching the videos crying.
yeah.
Um like it brings up stuff. And that's not good bad, like good, bad, or indifferent. It just brings up stuff. So I think when somebody has an injury, I think that's a transition that could bring up stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
When somebody gets traded, that could be a transition that brings up stuff.
Hmm.
If somebody, I mean, I actually looked at a injury report one day when I was with the Brewers and it said GSW.
Mm,
Like if the guy from the 49ers got shot in the chest. Like there are things that happen that are going to be things, whether they're in the moment or later. But to answer your question, yes, they will impact the data. What I find is if if things are treated right, people get back to baseline, just like
Hmm.
any other type of injury. It just makes sure that it's treated the right way at the right time.
Yeah. No, yeah, I love that. And then, again, we had Bianca McCall here locally. Again, much more in the mental health field, but definitely too within sports. And she talked about her definition of how she defined trauma. I think it was like a more way of just making it like sobering or so that somebody could connect with. Because when people hear the word trauma, they think this major, it's always this major
Yes.
thing, right? Like, but also as you mentioned, how she defined it was anything that changes how I view myself or the world was her like definition, which
Yeah.
is, again, encompasses,
That's broad.
yeah,
That's pretty
very,
broad.
very broad, right? So it
Yeah.
could be, there's micro traumas and there's, these major trauma events, but, again, when we say the word trauma, like as you mentioned, a lot of people think like, again, like I said, like it's some major injury to the brain, or there's some major, my dad died, or, my best friend, that I've been best friends with for 20 years, we got in this major fight and, X, Y, and Z, we're not, those things. But also too, it's like you mentioned, sometimes it's obviously if you use that more loose definition, there's a lot of things that can, as you said, can trigger something that bring up something that was from 30 years ago. Like for example, I'm gonna give you one that happens to me in very rare cases. Is we went to the ABCA this year. I'm flying back, 5 hour flight. About 3 hours into the flight, I start feeling claustrophobic, and
Oof.
I start having some, I still got 2 hours on this flight, and I feel like I can't move,
Oof.
and I start having this thing, and I'm trying to manage it, right? But it's really rare. It hardly ever happens to me. I fly all the time. It's not a problem. Like it's in rare situation, right? Which is like, and again, there's probably things behind that. I got to open up the box, and I was talking to my therapist actually about it a couple weeks ago. But we're the same thing too, as well as like, I think it's just interesting in those same ways where like obviously sometimes something specific needs to happen to trigger and stir
Yeah.
up
All
that,
that stuff up.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Comment.
you never know what's behind it, what triggers it, or what happens to pop it. And
Yeah.
I actually have come, not for your specific situation, but because this wouldn't apply directly to what you just said, but I've come to kind of believe that like our body and our brains know when we're ready for stuff.
Hmm.
So when people come to me with like, "Hey, I'm starting to get anxious about X, Y, or Z, and I'm wondering if it's something from X, Y, or Z,"
Yeah.
like I've actually started to frame that as like it, your brain's probably telling you you're ready to chat about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like
Like
that.
people oftentimes look at that as like oh God, I don't want to feel this, and I actually look at it like,
Hmm.
man, you're starting to feel this when you didn't feel it before, and now maybe you're ready to feel it, and let's make sure you kind of do that the right way. And that might be a trauma experience to kind of trigger
Yeah.
that, but it could be triggering it in a way like, hey, man, I think I'm healthy enough now to kind of like
Yeah.
work with that.
Yeah, at one,
Uh,
I like the perspective of like, hey, at one time, this response really served me. It was useful. Like, for
yeah,
example, like if I'm able to suppress my emotions, why my dad is on edge and he's ready to crack at any moment, and instead of me saying something back, I just held my tongue and I was just quiet and I didn't let my emotions let me get overwhelmed. Well, man, as a child, that served me really well. But
really well.
now I'm an adult, and that skill, it's being something that I'm hitting my, performance wise, it's holding me back, because I'm not speaking up when I do have other insight, or I'm worried
Yeah,
about confrontation now, or I'm suppressing all of my emotions and I'm just throwing them in the closet, and then at one point the closet busts open and
it's going to
everything,
open up.
yeah, and it explodes. And so I think that's a way of like looking at it too, where it's like, hey, like at one point I learned to cope with this in this way, and it did it. Man, it's a brilliant idea as
Or
a child. It's like an amazing idea to like be able to find something that, made you survive in that moment. But just
Yes.
because you survive doesn't mean that it's a thriving technique,
To go back to Freud, like defense mechanisms are good, but they're not the long-term strategies.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes we
And
make them the long term. And two, as we wrap up and just like on a honing skill, and I want to kind of just bring in your world, this is so normal, but for the coaches, I wanted to bring this as well. Is like I still actively play on the weekends. Again, I start, go to therapy, not because some major event happened, not because all these things, right? I actually was a lot into self-help when I was younger, and I read a lot of books, all these other things. And then social science was my associate's degree, and so I started getting some of the psychology, and I actually wanted to be a police officer, so I was studying criminal justice. So then you get into some of the psychology of crime, and why these things happen, right? And then Taylor with a big background in addicts, and man, like as you mentioned addicts earlier, addicts I feel like give you such an extreme where like it actually explains a whole bunch of behaviors that are outside of, you understand a lot of human behavior, period, just by studying, a lot of the addicts things and like just how society kind of views addicts. And then also within my church, we have a ton of recovering addicts that are, some of the best people I know, some of the people, right? And like all these things, right? And it all goes full circle. But the main reason I wanted to bring that up is the truth. And I just wanted to be an advocate here towards the end is that, man, like some of the freedom, and it wasn't just my faith or just therapy or just this or just that, but the combinations of all of those things working together, and how I feel like, God in a lot of ways has pointed and talked through some of these other people and these resources that have been put around me. But also too, man, like, what I felt like it's done in my own life and the freedom I've been able to achieve. And like for example, I had struggled with, from early ages, all those things of, in a lot of ways, the performer in me, the extrovert in me, the comedian in me, the performance, my high performance, these are all very external validation things that I was, like serving those other ways. And man, like as we've done, a lot of this work, and, shout to my a therapist and multiple therapists that I've had that have, helped me along the way is, man, there's a lot of freedom and performance that actually ends up being the end results on the opposite way. I'm a better CEO today. I'm a better friend today. I'm a better, again, hopefully a better dad, than I would have been, all those other things as well, because of a lot of this healing that's happened. And also too, a lot of this awareness of learning myself and my triggers and all these other led to a lot of the things that I get to do every day. So I'm just a big advocate of, again, long time ago is just like man up, all these things thrown out there where I'm like, man, no. Performance is highly tied to our brains. We need to really be familiar with our spiritual health, our mental health. All these things are all tied together, and not just be working on our bodies constantly and not understanding.
Thank you for telling that story. I mean, I'm sure it will help people who are listening.
Yeah.
And just to piggyback that from my perspective, if people are wondering, I don't know anybody that has ever said, I went to a therapist to get an assessment and it really screwed up my life.
That's fair. Yeah.
Like you could just walk in once. And by the way, the median amount of therapy sessions attended is one.
Yeah.
Like, so you can go in and be like, is this normal? Is this not normal? You get somebody bouncing off of, and it's like, yeah, you're good. Just maybe talk to some performance person. Like, so the take home message for me is, you don't have to talk to me ever. The take home message for me is, if the people are listening, like, there's no reason not to take somebody in just for a check-in at 16 years old or 18 years old or whatever, just to be like, hey, where am I at? Yeah. And then let that person kind of direct what might be best for you. There's nothing wrong with that. And insurance usually covers one session, even if you got bad insurance, and you're not gonna leave that session getting hurt.
Yeah. And the other thing I think on the other side of this too, as well, is just like, look, I think also too, people have this idea they're going to go see a therapist and that it has to be, well, I tried it once and it was like, hold on. I went and saw a couple different therapists until I found something
I connected with, and I felt like, was as good for me. I felt safe around. I felt like I could share, that was open to me. I've transitioned therapists from different times, right? And I think one of the other pieces, I just wanted to highlight here as well. One of the big motivational factors also for me as well is almost every high level performer in business and sport and all these other things, they all either talk about, again, a mentor, therapist, you psychologist. Like, again, even at our church, he's very open with it. My pastor, he talks about it. He's like, hey, again, I run one of the largest churches in America, all these other things. He's got a lot of pressures. He's got a lot of these other things, and he's very open. A lot of people just haven't been as open with it, but like really high performers, typically in the realm that I've been in, a lot of the pro guys that I've worked with, all these guys, like they're all going to see.
They got somebody. They got somebody. And it's great that they got somebody. And my model tends to be like, I got one guy that I'm with a lot, but the rest of them, it's like, come to me. We'll check in every month, every 2 months, every 3 months, whatever works for you, and you can have a chat. And it's not like you're diving deep every single month, but those check-ins are just a super good, valuable, like, hey, am I right in the right direction? Let me bounce this off you. Like, it's not like I'm sitting around talking about mom all day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I,
sorry, go ahead. Finish.
no, finish. Go ahead. I'm good.
I was just going to say, I just wanted to add in this area too. Another thing is I try to explain to people, it's just like a training session. When you come in and train with me, every time do you walk away and go, oh man, I had this major breakthrough on the most amazing man on the planet now. Like, no. Sometimes I go to therapy and we're just talking and I'm just catching him up. And he doesn't even get me. I'm just processing what happened, reflecting on this last week. He actively just helps me reflect. And then 3 weeks from now, I'm like, dude, I had such a big breakthrough this, in this session. So I think that's all. Also, I just wanted to throw out there. It's just like, yo, just because you went to therapy, and also on the other side of that, a lot of like you need to go for a little while. They need to know who the hell you are. They need to, accurately know what all those other things. And, I just wanted to put in that way as well. It's like, again, it's just like a coach, like your day one is not going to be, I might just talk about an evaluation, or we might just collect some things. I might get to know you a little bit. Like, it's not always this major breakthrough every single time, you go to,
and sometimes with what I was going to say, sometimes with those initial sessions, if with a 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid, whatever it is, like, it's just the fact that they know that this person does this, and I had a first conversation, so that in 8 months, if something were to come up, you don't have a barrier towards entry.
Yeah.
Like, this is already set up. Like, just go and chat. Like, I think that has so much value to me.
Yeah, no, agreed. And again, there's something about, like, as you mentioned, having somebody that is objective outside your sphere, right? Like you said, especially even if they're outside an organization. So if you're worried, this guy's in the organization, whatever, right? Having a guy outside the organization, awesome. I'm sure even the guy in the organization would recommend, if you're not seeing me, go see somebody.
I did that a lot.
Right. And it's like, I get it. There might be a barrier here because you think I'm working for the team. But at the same time, again, along with it, right? Like, I have somebody that it doesn't know any of my friends, that doesn't know anybody else in my life. He's the only person that I know, right? That is like within it, right? And it's like, man, there's a safety in that, right? That it's like, hey, I can, raw, and this is what I'm really, dealing with right now, and this is what I'm trying to work through, and this is where I'm at this week. And for me personally too, I found one that was, like CJ is he's rooted in his faith, and so a lot of times for me, he does a great job of pointing me back towards God, right? So for me, that's what I sometimes I just lose perspective, and he just, hey, he'll subtly, point me back, or and all the things, and I'll walk out just because I just had a perspective shift, and it got me more back to norm, right? Where it's, I had a tough week, and I started to believe the lies of the enemy, as I would say, right? I started to start to see the world in a darker place, and it's like, man, like, if I could, I don't need to carry that, and I started to carry something I didn't need to carry, and that's why the pressures felt so great, is I'm carrying all these things that are not mine, and I need to just put them down, and have some fun here.
And sometimes you just need a reminder. It's like looking over at the pitching coach and saying, "Hey, your lead shoulder's flying up. Get that thing closed again."
Like, and then he obviously gets juiced. Just like I feel like it's like when I'm with my players where I'm like, they start to do it themselves. Yeah. Cause I'll start telling them. And then I realized I started doing that thing again. I know it's connected to my, I know it's connected. I know I get like that. Sometimes I get pessimistic, or sometimes, again, I start having these anxieties that are coming from this, or whatever, or, specifically like within mine, right? I'll know that, I have some abandonment issues, right? And so because of that, I know what typically comes from those things. And so I can identify them as I've learned more and I've developed these skills over the years, just like our hitters can, when they all of a sudden go, yeah, I started pulling my shoulder. So I started doing this, this, and this. And I'm like, like amazing, like awesome.
And when you start to realize that at the end of the day, the phrase we use in player development is we want to make self-driving cars.
Yeah.
The more you do that as a coach, as somebody in my role, the more that they can get autonomous and kind of do that. I just think that that's great for giving that skill towards young people.
100%. Yeah. And so, I just wanted to be an advocate there and it's like be open with it. Cause I know that also, especially a lot of men have this barrier, right, of what they think it is, and especially older generations right now too as well. Younger, we've been open to it a little bit more, but also too, I wanted to add that other context too. It's just being like, again, like the first one isn't going to be your most amazing. He doesn't have to be, if you don't like the guy, you don't like the guy, or you don't like the girl, you don't like the girl. Like, go see somebody else. And also too, not everyone's going to be a breakthrough. And again, I'm not telling you to go do something or try something out that I haven't, I don't find, great value from. And that's why every week, and so, and also too, I'm going to say from the other side of this, I'm not even going based off insurance. Like I'm paying this guy straight out of pocket just because I enjoy it so much, and I get so much from it. So, it's been big for me and my performance and again, disconnect performance. Even performance has a whole nother layer than physical performance, right? Everything's connected together. It's like, our business makes a lot more money because I work on myself. Like my business, and our employees are in much better positions with someone that is, actively trying to get better and actively, has a plan of, and other people in their corner, right, where I can go to them and be a better leader for them and those things as well. So, I just wanted to be an advocate towards there and also be an advocate towards what you're doing. And also that there's these major unlocks for understanding that, what's going on above the neck, so I think it's huge.
Super appreciative of your time. First podcast I've done with like kind of laying all this stuff out there, and it was super easy. So I appreciate that very much.
No, it's fun. I'm sure we'll have more too as well as you get closer in some of the things you're developing, all those other things too. We'd love to, talk at more of these things. And like, for example, like Bianca, I've had Bianca on. I think she's like the most common guest I've had. I think I've had her like 3 times. So I love talking about some of these things and, opening different conversations because I know we could talk for hours and go a bunch of different ways and all of that. So no, I appreciate the conversation. It was great finally getting to see your face and getting to talk. So
you as well. I heard great things and I appreciate the conversation very much.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys. Well, why don't you kind of just give everybody a point or somewhere that, your website or other ways that they can go and look into more of what you're doing or kind of learn more about some of this stuff too.
Yeah, it's in development. So I'm a little bit hesitant now because it's probably going to get changed and maybe go in like a month or so. But my current site is noyn.com.
Got it.
Probably more important than the site, just my email address is matt.krug, Krug @noyn.com. And then, maybe I can come back in the middle of the year and we can take a deeper dive in some of the other stuff.
Yeah, no, it'd be awesome. So definitely with some of those resources. And again, you guys can check out some of that stuff. We'll add it in the short show notes and all that stuff. And then I'm sure we'll circle back around and this will be a great conversation for people to reference too, as we do other ones. So appreciate your time, Matt. And we'll jump on here again soon.
Sounds good. Appreciate you. Have a great one.